And this is the usual slide for the license, citation, etc., and various acknowledgements. And here is a figure that you've already seen before in David's introductory slide. And this is what is the positive feedback loop cycle that is making life complex for all of us who are working in the area of scientific computing through simulations and basically scientific computing through scientific discovery through computation. Cannot speak. Okay. So, and the positive feedback loop is that as you gain more scientific so when you start out in a new field, you take a model, you make many approximations for it because there is no way you're going to be able to handle everything all at once. So you basically whittle it down to a really small, simple model. You do exploratory work with it. As your scientific understanding grows, you start to remove some of those approximations and you start to put in higher fidelity model. And then when you put higher fidelity model, what that means is that you are going to need more diverse solvers because different terms in your equation. And I am speaking, you can assume that when I'm speaking about something, even though it refers to partial differential equation based solutions, because that's what I'm more familiar with, it actually, there is no loss of generality in the sense that many of the same concepts apply to the other kinds of scientific computing as well. There are exceptions, but there is a broad range of scientific applications to which these things apply. So then when you have different terms, they require different solvers to solve them. And when you have more solvers or you want more resolution, you need more hardware resources. When you use more hardware resources, you get more scientific understanding, and the whole cycle goes on and on. What I like to think of at least in parallel and extreme scale computing is two epochs. The first epoch was the distributed memory model, which has dominated the first 30 years or so of the time that high performance computing basically became the third leg of scientific discovery. And here, as you can see from this line, the platform complexity was increasing very slowly, but the software complexity was increasing as the understanding kept getting better and better. And that's because we were basically in the distributed memory model or the cluster-based model where as long as you were careful about your design with regard to distributing work evenly among different nodes, the nodes basically did not differ significantly from one to another. So if you followed some basic principles of code writing, you would basically get a code that would run well across a broad class of platforms. And now we are in this second epoch, which is where it's not just the applications that are getting more heterogeneous, it is also the platforms that are getting more heterogeneous. And therefore, the overall complexity of the applications and their ability to run on a range of platforms has become very much more challenging. There are these added problems that happen with scientific software. It is that many of the components may be under research because it is all about discovery after all. In my experience, the use of software for two different scientific campaigns is never the same. Things are customized, added, tweaked, etc., because all of the use cases that one is working with are different and are unique. And so these are added complications that one has to work with when one is dealing with scientific software. And so there are ways in which the general design principles need considerations and they pose challenges. So what I have done is on the left are the considerations that we want to take into account as we are designing and the implications of those considerations in terms of how the design should come out. So first of these is the consideration that one has to keep in mind is that the days of API and their students and postdoc working on a simple problem. I mean, it's not that they've been completely eliminated, but they are fewer now than the situations where a team it's a multidisciplinary team that needs to bring in many facets of knowledge. And that might include the domain knowledge, the numerical methods, applied mathematics, performance engineering, software engineering, et cetera, et cetera. And so for any one person to know everything is no longer feasible. Or at least not feasible if all of these things need to be done well. So what that means is the design implication is that separation of concerns should be baked into the design so that the developers are shielded from knowing about complexities that they do not need to deal with. So in the times of distributed memory parallel computing, for example, it was enough to separate out the message passing from the in-node code, and you would get separation of concerns where the numerical algorithms could be developed sequentially by people who were good at applied mathematics, and they could be integrated in with the message passing interface and with some the things that people had to take into account were things like data locality for cache optimization, but those things could be handled separately. So that was the separation of concerns. The second part is that in any non-trivial code, non-trivial scientific code, there are two types of components. There is the framework or the infrastructure, and then there are the science models. So the framework or the infrastructure handles things like your discretization, your management of environment, et cetera, whereas the science model is where actually the mathematics is implemented, mathematics of your model and the numerical method is implemented. And so it is important that they should work with different life cycles. Where the infrastructure works is a much more long-lasting type of code, whereas it is not so very mathematically complex, but it has more logical complexity than the science models, the numerical models, which they usually tend to be a lot more mathematically complex than logically complex. Not universally, but largely that is the case. So then the third consideration is that codes will always grow. And you will write a code and you will think that you're going to do one science campaign with it and that is going to be the end of it. The chances are someone will come along, find that it is a useful bit of code. If only they could add this one little feature into it, and then they can use it for their purposes. And so you almost always have to assume that if you wrote something useful, it is going to grow in size and new ideas will bring in new features. The code may want to be reused by others. And therefore, when you are designing the code, you have to make sure that extensibility is built into it, which translates into the ease of adding new capabilities and customizing existing capabilities. Both of these happen on a very regular basis in all the codes that I've had anything to deal with. So this is a schematic for what the general design principles for HPC scientific software ought to look like, is that you treat the different types of codes differently. So there is the code that is subject to research, which is where your models and numerics live. And that code is treated as the client code, whereas the more stable code is the discretization, IO runtime parameters, et cetera, that is the infrastructure or the framework code. This handles data structures and movement, and this needs to be taken more carefully, designed more carefully. It may even be that this kind of code can benefit from taking a closer to waterfall approach to design than agile, because once you've got this in place, changes to this are usually pervasive and they affect all of the other parts of the code also. But the things that one should apply to both types of codes is that you should have locally separable functional units of computation, which means in other words, modularity. It should all be encoded into a framework. As much as possible, various code capabilities should be interacting with each other through a well-defined API, and they should all be differentiated. You should be cognizant of the scope of various data objects that you've created in your code, and you should make sure that that scope is well understood and adhered to. So you differentiate between protected and public parts of the API as well as the data structures. But the most important thing, and this is a mistake that many people make, is that people think of a design, a programming model, and design their code to that specific programming model, which is a very dangerous approach, because what if that programming model changed? And then you have to completely change your code. So a better approach is to design first, doing these things that I've outlined, the modularization, the separation of concerns, the separation into framework and model, et cetera, and then map the programming model that you're interested in onto that design. This way, you're more likely to have a long-lived code that stands the test of time. So here is a design model for separation of concerns. This, again, has been known to work, has been exercised in at least half a dozen codes that I know of that are based on partial differential equation solvers, and I think it applies to other types as well, is that you have the infrastructure and you have the capabilities. Now, the cycles that are in blue here are things that are result of separation of concerns, and therefore can be done independently. It's the red boxes where the interactions happen between the infrastructure and the capabilities. So the cycle for the infrastructure looks like you do a more thorough requirements gathering than you would for, say, your numerical methods, because you want to know what kind of an API you want to produce, what kind of extensibility you want to have, et cetera, et cetera. You would do the software architecture and API design, implement, test, and then there is this feedback loop, because chances are that your design will still need some tweaking before you're done. And then you get into the maintenance mode, whereas for the capabilities, you're doing design and development and validation, and then you build an API for it through which other physics, because it's not always that the interaction is only happening between the framework and the physics capability. You can even have interactions happening between various physics capabilities. So it is important for the physics also to publish its API. And that then becomes known to the framework, and it's the time of integration where you need to augment the framework for the framework to know the API is when these interactions need to happen. Augmentations can also happen when you're adding a completely new capability, or they can happen because of customization. But these two are largely independent control flows in the process of development that enable separation of concerns. So to go back to the running example that was originally introduced to you during the Math Libraries Day, we have this problem of the heat equation solution based upon this problem that you're already exposed to. So if, say, we were to be working with this problem and we wanted to design a code. This is a very simplistic example, but let's see if we can apply these principles of separation of concerns and looking at different aspects of the code as with different life cycles. So here, our problem specification is that we need to solve the heat equation with some initial and boundary conditions. The other thing that we want to do is we want to be able to apply different integration methods. So we don't want to be stuck with just one particular integration method. We want to be able to apply different integration methods. So going back to the figure here in terms of what is our infrastructure and what is our client code. The infrastructure here is the discretization and the state, the code bits that exist for verification, the IO, the application of initial conditions, and the runtime parameter and comparison tools. The model here is basically the integration method and the initial conditions and the boundary conditions we are applying to the problem. So the infrastructure API, if you've looked at the GitHub repository that contains the hands-on part of the code, you will see that these exist. And so these are part of the infrastructure API, where this is taking the runtime, the arguments that you invoke when you invoke the code, the initialization. This is a utility for copying. This is the utility for output, and then the initial condition setting. This is the infrastructure API for that code. And the numerics API or the model API is the various integration methods. So we have Crank-Nicholson, Upwind, FTCS, et cetera, and even a computing of exact solution. And then this is the L2 norm is there for the purpose of verification of correctness, where you compare the L2 norm of your solution against the exact solution to verify that you have actually done the right computation. Sorry. So this is a very simple way of separating out the two codes and the methodology for dealing with them. Now let's go to a slightly, much more complex, more likely to be a real life problem situation, which is architecting of multiphysics PDEs. This one comes from the era of distributed memory model, where the separation of concern, and so this is basically looking at, even among solution of PDEs, this is looking at a relatively simple problem, which is basically assuming that you have mostly explicit methods for solving your partial differential equation. As we all know, for explicit methods of solving, domain decomposition is basically your cells that you want to update surrounded by the halo of cells that are obtained either from an external boundary or from a neighbor cell. And when you do that, the solver cannot tell the difference between the full domain and the partial domain that you're giving it to solve. And so this is the basic abstraction we work with. And what we have is a real view, and then we generate two virtual views for it. So the real view is that you have a whole domain with many operators. And we are assuming that we are able to do the time integration with operator splitting. So that's the view, is that whole domain with many operators. There is the spatial decomposition. So the virtual view becomes domain sections as a standalone computation unit. And then there is the functional decomposition, which is basically different operators. And the virtual view is collection of components. And so we do, so here, the virtual view is implemented by domain experts and applied mathematicians. And the domain decomposition and load balancing, et cetera, is all implemented by software and performance engineers, and the optimizations are done by the software and performance engineers. So this is how we achieve separation of concerns here. As an example, I will talk about Flash, which is the code that I've been most familiar with. So in Flash, the assumption always was that capabilities will be added for better models. So it was always designed so that it could be assembled for components. And so what it did was it decentralized the maintenance of metadata, so that with each bit of code, for example, this API and this API, they both have their own metadata that contains information such as which other units it needs to work with, which units it won't work with, which are the state variables it needs, et cetera. And then there is a tool that parses and configures the application. So the key idea here is distributed intelligence. And keep this in mind, because when we go into more complicated heterogeneous code, this comes into play again. Okay, so Up until now, our takeaways for design considerations have been that we need to differentiate between slow changing and fast changing components. It's critical to understand the requirements of the infrastructure because that is the longest living component. You have to implement separation of concerns, and in your design, portability, extensibility, reproducibility, and maintainability should be baked in. And you should not design with a specific programming model in mind. You should map the programming model to your design, as this binding should happen as late as possible in the process. Okay. Now we move to the new paradigm because of platform heterogeneity. And the question is, do the design principles change? And the answer is not really. It is only that the details get more involved. So the changes that happened are in the APIs, because the API becomes more finer grained. It has to become more finer grained for both the infrastructure side and the physics side. But really, the maximum change is likely to occur where the integration is happening between the infrastructure and the API. The general design principles as outlined by people in the exascale computing project to the various application teams that are developing these products for being prepared for exascale platforms are these 5 basic principles: is that they should design for hierarchical parallelism, think about several thousand threads, assume that there will be hierarchy in memory space, and therefore they need to think about counting, allocating, and using memory, and they should be not basically not exposing any vendor specific or other non-portable options into their design choices. So with that in mind, and what we talked about here, what happens to the design now? What happens to the design now is, if we go back to the same partial differential equations based code that we were sort of working with, we get a few additional things that we need to do. So the virtual view, which was domain sections as standalone computation units, now, need to have added abstractions, and therefore more finer grained API for runtime management, because now we also have to deal with data being moved between devices. The load distribution is not as simple as just distributing it on different memory, different MPI ranks. There are other considerations for load distribution. And so the offloading and scaling optimization is a lot more complex. Also, it is true that the data layouts that are optimal for different devices differ. And so if you want to have any kind of unified expression of your calculation, you need some kind of code transformation tools. Otherwise, you will have a combinatorial explosion of the number of versions of code that you may end up having to maintain. And so you need abstraction at the solver level that can then do the memory access and compute optimization. So how do the abstraction layers work? The abstraction layers that are around and are used by many of the codes are, they infer the structure of the code. They also infer the map between the algorithms and the devices. They infer the data movements. Then they map the computations to devices. And these can be done either through constructs that are many of the C++ based abstraction tools are doing, or it can be done with pragmas like OpenMP is doing, OpenMP and OpenACC is doing. But all of these are just ways in which you express your computations with these are the means that map from here to here through the tools that are provided by these blue boxes. It still remains true that in order to use these tools well, you have to understand the structure of your program, and you have to do the design so that these tools can be exploited usefully. To take the step to deconstruct what these abstraction tools do a little bit more, so that tells you how to go about designing your codes a little bit more, is that what they count on is a way to let the compiler know that this particular expression can be specialized in many ways. And the reason why I'm doing this deconstruction is that most of these tools that are available right now are based upon C++ template metaprogramming. And so it seems like if you are not working with C++, you're pretty much left to your own devices. But if you understand the principles or the steps that these C++ based tools are utilizing, then you can actually come up with your own series of tool chain that has intelligence distributed among various tools, and you can basically build your system to be able to do the same kind of abstractionism. So in the C++ tools, it's the metaprogramming in abstraction layers that lets the compiler know that the expression can be specialized in many ways, and then there is the corresponding definition of specializations. Then there is assignment of work within the node. Many of these have parallel for or directives with unified memory, or directives or specific programming model for explicit data movement. So you can have, for example, in OMP, you can say target data, you can declare the data differently and the data will move. And in C++ based template metaprogramming tools, you can have parallel for that launches the kernel onto your remote device, etc. If you want to do more asynchronous computation, you need more complex data orchestration system. And there are systems out there that provide that too. For example, there is Legion, and then there are a whole bunch of asynchronous task-based programming model tools. And there are also now a cottage industry of specialized, much simpler tools that are in existence. But basically, this is what you need. These are the two main components that need to be accounted for in whatever system of abstraction that you're trying to use. And so you look at what is needed and you design for commonalities. This is important even when you're using third-party abstraction tools, because understanding the code structure and needs is critical for performance portability. And that really does translate into investing in design. So the final takeaways from what I have told you so far in this presentation is that the key to both performance portability and longevity of your code and its ease of use is basically careful software design. As I said before, the extensibility should be absolutely built into the design. It should be within the DNA of your design. The design should be independent of any specific programming model. I cannot emphasize that enough. This is the most common mistake I have seen in codes that ultimately need to be abandoned and started from scratch again, is because they assumed a programming model instead of understanding, deconstructing the structure of their code first in their own minds. And then, of course, the composability and flexibility always help with performance portability. And here is a list of some of the resources that you can look up further in order to see more detailed examples of design and so on. And with that, I come to an end of this presentation.
Thanks, Anshu, and we can take a minute or two for questions. I haven't seen anything well, there is one in the chat, a comment from Isaac, actually, who asks, is this really applicable to small teams? Says, most importantly, generally in scientific environments, software engineers to develop the framework are not part of the common capabilities that you have.
That depends on what you view as the framework. If you're thinking of framework as something that is an entity in its own right, it's a different story, but it doesn't matter what you are doing with your code, whether you like it or not, some form of framework exists in your code, because there is something that is doing the discretization, there is something that is managing the IO, there is something that is managing the runtime environment. It can be the simplest possible thing, but it is there. And if you want any sort of usability, reusability in your code, you can't get away from having to do this. So even if it's not someone with the specialized knowledge of building frameworks is doing it, even if you are doing it in your own code for your own, say, PhD work or a postdoctoral work, you should think about, you should still view your code as consisting of something that is longer lived and provide services, and something that is the physics model and therefore will change often. You will always find that to be useful.